Stop the world!
So it's an accelerator of many of the existing risks. It's not a new risk, it's not a separate risk, but it's something that drives the risks that we are already facing. And it's very important that we understand how that works. If you don't understand the risks that you are facing, how can you address them?
Welcome back to Stop the World, ASPI's podcast on foreign affairs and security. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm Justin Bassi.
It's a double episode week on the podcast this week, and in today's episode, Justin, you speak to General Tom Middendorp from the Netherlands.
That's right, Liv. General Middendorp, otherwise known as the Climate General, joined me for a conversation on the links between climate change and security. Middendorp is former Chief of the Netherlands Defence Forces and is Chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. We discussed climate risks across the Pacific, South and Southeast Asia, how climate change is impacting the military, and the role of technology and innovation in responding to climate change.
I think it's important to make the connection and not address climate change as a separate issue. It's not a separate threat. It's also not a military problem, but it does have a huge security dimension to it.
You also discussed the growing global population and the pressure that's being placed on natural resources.
So there is a growing gap between demand and supply globally. We cannot solve that gap by producing twice as much as we are doing now, because it only increases the gap. So the solution is, how can we produce more with less resources?
It's an important and timely conversation given COP29 is underway in Azerbaijan. Justin, over to you and General Middendorp.
General Tom Middendorp, former Chief of Defence of the Netherlands and now Chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Thank you for joining me on the ASPI podcast, Stop the World.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Great. Well, you really have had an illustrious career, spending almost 40 years, 38 years in the Defence Force. And last year you released a book called Climate General, which I encourage everyone to read. So it's a pleasure to have you here at ASPI. Can you start by telling our listeners the reason for your visit? What brings you to Australia?
Well, the book triggered many things, amongst one that the ambassador of the Netherlands here in Australia thought it would be very useful to share those experiences here in Australia, because there's a very lively debate on this topic, and it might be good to have some other insights from the other side of the world on the same topic, to have some reflection on it. So they set up a whole program, and here I am.
Excellent. The sharing of experiences in these areas is crucial. I think no doubt what you are finding is more recognition here that we need to share experiences not just within our own region, but between our region and Europe, of course. And climate and security have not always gone together. So it really is interesting that you've gone from being Chief of the Defence Force in the Netherlands to Chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. So let's talk about climate and security. What do you think has happened in recent years to see that separation collapse and more people talking about climate as a security matter? How do you ensure that the public is also aware of how important climate is to our security?
Oh, you're completely right. They are natural friends. And not naturally associated with each other. So people were very upset when I first addressed this 8 years ago, because I come from the defense sector, and that's more right-wing politicians, and climate was more a left-wing Green Party topic. So they were very, very surprised that I addressed this. But I increasingly experienced in my missions how the one leads to the other, how a changing climate creates all kinds of tensions in population, takes away the perspective of life of people, and how that drives people into despair, and how that results in internal stability or instability, how that results in migration flows and extremism, etc., etc. And my eye-opening moment was in Afghanistan, where I led the Dutch-Australian task force in Uruzgan province, where we had been fighting in a village for days to free that village of Taliban. And in the end we succeeded, but only to find out that the tensions remained. And it took a while before we realized it was all about water scarcity. They are farmers, they need water, there wasn't enough water, they couldn't agree, and that gave tensions. And once we realized that, we were able to negotiate a solution on how to divide the water, then suddenly it became quiet. From that moment on, we didn't have one problem in that village anymore. And for me, that was an eye-opening moment that made me realize that we are often fighting the symptoms of problems without fully understanding the deeper causes of that problem. And that deeper cause is increasingly related to a changing climate. And I've seen that over and over again in Iraq, in Somalia, in Mali, in many, many countries. So to me, it became evident that climate change might well be one of the biggest game changer of this century, also from a security perspective.
And is that, Tom, one of your primary roles as chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security to try and increase the understanding of those links between the military realm and the climate realm?
Yeah, absolutely, because climate change for most military is something very distant. It's not something that relates to their work. They find climate, okay, it's important, but for other departments, not for us. So they don't all appreciate how these two are related to each other. And when I first addressed this publicly, it created a big shock in my own country with big debates in parliament, screaming headlines, etc., etc. And that gave me this nickname, the Climate General. And I decided to embrace that nickname, to use it as a title of honor and to continue on this because I saw the devastating impacts. And I also realized that in the 5.5 years I've been Chief of Defense, and I met many, many times with all my colleagues in NATO and EU, the word climate has not been mentioned once. So we had a long way to go. And that made me very committed to pick this up. And a year later, I retired. And I found out that there are more military leaders like me who shared its concerns. So we decided to establish this network called the International Military Council on Climate and Security, which is a network of experts, of leaders in the security sector. And we now have leaders from more than 40 countries all over the world, which creates a voice, a common voice, and also kind of a uniting factor. And beneath that, there is another network building up, and that's more the scientific network of institutes cooperating on building knowledge on the nexus between climate and security. And both together is very strong because you can speak on behalf of a wide audience, but also a sound scientific basis underneath that really opens doors. And I found that a very fruitful way of operating.
Let's talk a bit about those debates that you stirred up, that you caused, because of course there are many people who will say, well, militaries are there to deter conflict and, if necessary, to fight and defend countries and regions, and notwithstanding a nexus between climate and security, there should be a range of other portfolios that are the dominant players in ensuring that we tackle climate change and the impacts of climate change. So how Tom, do you, in your current role in particular, but also advice for military generals still today and their counterparts, how do you get the balance right? That we here in Australia, of course, we suffer significant bushfires, we suffer floods, and often the defence forces, particularly the army, are brought in to help the recovery. But one of the issues that we do face here, and it was in our Defence Strategic Review that the government released last year, a concern that often the army or defence should be the last resort in terms of disaster relief and climate recovery. And there is a risk perhaps that militaries become the first resort. Yeah. So how do you get that balance right? And was that part of the debate that you saw when you first raised it?
Yeah, I think it's important to make the connection and not address climate change as a separate issue. It's not a separate threat. It's also not a military problem, but it does have a huge security dimension to it. And it's important to realize that. And I use operational examples out of my own experience to explain that to other military, and they recognize that. Because they've all been in mission areas, they've all witnessed that same impact of a changing climate. So if you address it from an operational perspective, then they suddenly understand why this relationship is important. And I explained to them that climate change shapes our security environment in many ways. On a global level, it reinforces the global gap between demand and supply that we are facing. It reinforces global strategic competition between superpowers. which creates all kinds of future conflicts and tensions. On a regional level, it's a big disruptor in many countries, disrupting the internal security, leading to instability, leading to migration flows, extremism, etc. So it's an accelerator of many of the existing risks. It's not a new risk. It's not a separate risk, but it's something that drives the risks that we are already facing. And it's very important that we understand how that works. If you don't understand the risks that you are facing, how can you address them?
It's a very good question. So is that gaining of understanding the crucial part while ensuring that militaries continue to be focused on their core mission of deterrence, preparation, conflict fighting, or do you think that the core mission is changing?
Both. I think climate change also accelerates the need for that core mission. So it doesn't distract from it, but it does bring a higher risk of being being needed for that core mission. So in that sense, it's nothing different. But it also increases the chance of support for natural disasters. And I completely agree, this should not be a primarily military kind of effort. It's an effort for first responders, civil responders. But the nature of disasters is that it is so huge that these civil responders are just not capable of dealing with it. They are over-demanded and they cannot keep up with it. They are often themselves affected by these disasters. So it's a kind of an all-hands-on-deck moment, including defense. Whether you like it or not, defense is an organization that can scale up easily, that can provide that kind of help easily, and there is no other organization that can do that. It is part of our work, and I think we need to adapt to that. If it means that it brings an additional burden on the military, then we need to finance that and make sure that they are capable of dealing with both. Natural disaster, supporting civilian authorities, but at the same time making sure that they can deal with their core business.
So that has to be the key, doesn't it, Tom, that in increasing the burden then on defence to tackle these climate-related issues, we just can't afford to have the military degrade its capabilities in its core areas. So I suppose part of the debate I'm sure you were having is from people saying, well, defence shouldn't be and the military shouldn't be punished for being an excellent institution in what it does. How about some of the other institutions, non-military institutions, improve in their areas so that we can tackle climate change more broadly? But it's what you're saying is it's all hands on deck. All sectors need to understand they play a role.
Yeah, and of course these first responders, it's their first responsibility. They need to deal with it. But yeah, they are often not capable of dealing with it, so they need help. And then defense is a second responder and needs to step in.
And clearly your advocacy has had some impact around both individual military institutions and also broader groupings. NATO has been showing a new form of leadership or new interest in building climate risk assessments into its analysis of what is emerging by way of trends and threats. And even in last year's annual climate security impact report that NATO published, they covered climate as a risk, including in relation to the Indo-Pacific. Australia, of course, isn't a NATO member, but we are one of the Indo-Pacific four that is having closer and closer engagement relations with NATO. Do you think that as part of the all-hands-on-deck element of needing to tackle climate as a security issue, do you think that NATO and its members should look for closer collaboration with Australia and other countries in this region?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. The security questions we are facing are more global in nature, which also is more suitable for cooperation around the world and with like-minded countries. And there's a lot we can learn from each other. By cooperating, you can become more interoperable. It makes it easier to work with each other in operational circumstances. You can share knowledge on building insights in how these risks are evolving. So there is a lot of win-win that's out there. And I think cooperation is key in dealing with the challenges we face. Also here in the Pacific is increasingly important. It's the arena for strategic competition. The Pacific is also a focal point in this climate disruption. If you look at South Asia, I found it terrifying to see what's happening there. This is a ticking time bomb in many regards. The whole coastal area is urbanized. Many megacities are located there, confronted with sea level rise and flooding of rivers. Billions of people are are living there that are directly affected. So just imagine the enormous disruption that can occur there. It's also the factory of the world, so it has immediately spin-off effects on our economies, on our supply lines. So there is a lot at stake here. And that also calls for cooperation.
Really well said. And I think from an Australian perspective, we have definitely come to understand the existential nature of the threat that our Pacific Island nations face. And so the discussions have very much increased in that area with those island states. You mentioned the impact on places like Afghanistan, South Asia, the factories of the world. Often from an Australian perspective, we also hear about the impact in Africa. We see all the impact throughout Europe, but perhaps less attention is placed on Southeast Asia. So keen to hear a bit more on where you were going just then about how important it is for countries like Australia and European states to work not just in the traditional areas, but also in areas like Southeast Asia where there are high risk both to individual states, but then that flow-on impact. And keen to hear your views on whether it's that type of discussion that can actually resonate with people to ensure that we're not just talking about impact to other countries that may be far away, but how that impact can then impact us.
Yeah. Well, I think there are different kinds of risks in South Asia. I've been traveling through Bangladesh for the filming of my book, by the way, which very interesting experience. But I was struck by the enormous change that's going on there, not just on the coastal areas, but also in the north of Bangladesh, where 20 million people live in the river area, with islands that are disappearing more quickly and coming up more quickly. So the dynamic in that area is changing, making it almost impossible for people to live there. So this is becoming increasingly an existential issue. And not just for the Pacific Islands, but also for parts or even whole countries in South Asia. And that brings all kinds of new questions to the table. Where can these people go to? What do you do with the identity of a country that is involved? All kinds of legal connections to it. So that is one big security concern, I would say, because that triggers all kinds of instability and migration flows. A second one is about water. The Himalayan mountains are the source of water for the whole South Asian region. All the rivers, they come from those mountains. And these mountains the snow is melting, so on the longer term, the water supply of the region, where almost 5 billion people are living, is at stake. But at the current moment, China is building all kinds of dams. There are now plans for building an additional, I believe, 100 dams in that region. So they can control the flow of water through the region. And they can secure their own water supply, but at the same time, they influence the water supply of all those countries. And that can easily be weaponized. That can easily be used as an instrument of pressure on those countries. So that also changes the geopolitical dynamics in the region. And of course, the example I just gave with the coastal areas being very, very vulnerable to floodings, where all these megacities are located, is another game changer that really affects the supply chains of the whole world. And last but not least, there is the whole energy transition, where we become more depending on rare minerals and other materials that come from China. So dependencies are changing as well. And Ukraine has shown us that dependencies can easily become vulnerabilities. So also from that perspective, it is a crucial region.
I'm keen to unpick, I think you've honed in on something that is incredibly challenging, that, of course, all governments want to try and solve the climate challenges that we face, but we need to be conscious that, as in all other security areas, there are second-order effects. Yep. And you've referred to a few of them, that if you allow yourself to get into a dependency situation, is that going to become such a vulnerability that it becomes a security threat to your long-term sovereignty? And so keen to understand your thinking, how you advise your stakeholders to best balance needing to solve the climate problems that we have, whether it be reducing emissions, whether it be water supply, as you say, by not then creating either monopoly risks or security risks by choosing technology that might have vulnerabilities in them, whether in the technology itself, in the supply chain, or indeed when it comes to issues like solar technology, issues around human rights abuses through regions like Xinjiang in China. So how do we get this wicked balance right? And what is your advice to countries that are clearly in desperate need of solving these climate-related issues? But how do we then say, but be aware that we don't want to try and solve this while creating either a security or human rights problem that we're going to have to then deal with later?
Yeah, big question. But I think the key is in the word self-sufficiency. I think it's very important that we innovate in a different way, that we look for ways to become more resource independent. And that connects to the earlier thing I explained about this global gap between demand and supply. We have a almost doubling world population, which means a doubling demand for water, for resources, etc. And we are already running into resource scarcity. So there is a growing gap between demand and supply globally. We cannot solve that gap by producing twice as much as we are doing now, because it only increases the gap. So the solution is, how can we produce more with less resources? Which is a new area of innovation, because at this moment our whole economy is based on translating resources into garbage, to say it honestly. And 92% of all the resources we use is not being reused. So there's a huge potential here. Let's be honest, we have never designed our products that way, because we always had an abundance of resources. I think there's plenty of opportunity to come to new kinds of innovations that enable us to become more circular, to become less resource dependent, and that would take away a huge source of future conflicts. So to me, this is all about conflict prevention. It's about innovating on new areas and becoming more resource independent. And that also helps to reduce this dependencies on countries that can use it against you. And Ukraine has proven that that is the new tool of war. We use economic dependencies to hit another party. And this innovation is not just about reducing resource dependency, but also about innovating on the use of other materials that are less scarce. And for instance, on batteries, there is a lot of innovation going on now to build batteries using sand or using other materials that we have plenty of. And then you avoid these kind of dependencies. So it's all about innovation, I would say.
Yeah, so in terms of then trying to encourage innovation that will work in the long term while trying to also manage the short-term impacts, is your phrase of trying to seek to be more resource independent. That is, am I putting words in your mouth to say gaining resource independence will not only protect us from the possibility of economic coercion and aggression from a country like China, but would actually position us best in the future to be able to manage our own climate challenges in the most efficient way as well, and then help other countries in our region with their own climate issues. Is that what you mean by increasing your resource independence?
Well, I think it can be a win-win situation. By innovating on these areas, you can help mitigate the climate problem, but at the same time create resource independency. So you meet both ends. Yeah. You make them both meet. And for a military perspective, resource independency can also help to create self-sufficiency. The military is a very logistically heavy organization. We have big supply lines running into all kinds of countries over thousands of kilometers through dangerous areas. It's a big risk factor. It's a big cost factor. the more you can become self-sufficient by using these new technologies, by producing your own energy, producing your own water, producing your own spare parts, etc., the more you can reduce that footprint, and the more you can put that money where you actually want to use it, is in your operational effectiveness. So I think it can also help military to become more effective and lose less effort and money on supporting that effort.
Yeah, and is a corollary of that, even though you use the word independence, that actually that's where trusted partnerships matter, that you can increase your independence by working still with others. And is that something that you think countries like the Netherlands and Australia can do more of working out, like we do in other areas in the defence field, working out which defence partnerships are best, that we can then, as you say, if we individually don't necessarily have all the resources, but collectively we can. Is that the same case here?
Yeah, I think so. But not only between countries, but also public-private. And that's a big change that's also going on at this moment, what I see in Europe and in the US, that it is a driver for new kinds of public-private cooperations to collectively find new innovative solutions to the problems we face. And yeah, I think this is very much an area of cooperation also with Australia and New Zealand. You are uniquely positioned here in the Pacific, and you have plenty of space, plenty of sun, plenty of wind, so you can be a front runner on this if you want.
And is that something that you are seeking to do in your trip here to Australia, to say to your Australian stakeholders, both in terms of your old defence counterparts, as well as our broader establishment, that we can play a broader role? Australia can be a partner in a way that if a country is saying, well, I need to address my climate risk here, and China, for example, is offering all of these infrastructure deals that look really good, are you suggesting and advocating that Australia can actually provide alternatives that are more secure and more reliable and better for the region?
Well, I'm not here to tell Australia what to do. I can't do that. But what I do is I share the best practices that are out there. And I think we can learn a lot from each other. So I try to provide some reflection on what's going on outside of Australia, how other Western countries are dealing with it, what kind of change I see coming up now. And I think that change offers new opportunities for Australia as well. But they have to make their own choices, of course, and they have to translate that to a Pacific region that they know much better than I do. So who am I to tell them what to do?
Well, that's the sharing of experiences, as you said at the beginning. I'm sure they would value your advice anyway, Tom. We could talk for a lot longer on this range of issues that you've raised. So I do hope we can have you back on to look at a few of these areas in more detail. But apart from your book, of course, Climate General, I do like to ask our pod guests for their best book recommendations, particularly in the areas that they're interested in. So apart from Climate General, anyone interested in climate security related issues, is there another book out there that you would advise them to read to get across these issues?
Well, more and more, yeah. The topic is really picking up. My counterpart in the US, Sherry Goodman, just wrote a book called Risk Multiplier. And I found another interesting book is The Ministry of the Future. I don't know if you know it. It's a very interesting book because they place us 20 years further in time when we all recognize that this is an overarching problem and the world has created this ministry, this global ministry of the future that has to address this challenge of climate change. And it shows the scenarios, fictive scenarios that we are in at that moment. Enormous heat in India, temperatures up to 50 degrees, people dying because of it, and how to deal with that. It's a very interesting book to read.
Well, two excellent suggestions on top of your own book, of course, Tom. I encourage everyone who has an interest in this area to go out and get them. I think there's no doubt that we are seeing across the world more and more national security establishments recognising the connection between climate and security. I think the conversation around defence's role in climate is something that deserves more discussion, both in the context, as you say, of where defence is best placed in disaster relief, but also, by the sounds of it, in terms of their own future planning and in terms of defence's operations within their own operational areas. So, Tom, I'm sure you'll get a lot of interest on your trip out here in Australia. I do hope that you come back soon, and of course you're always welcome back on the Aspie Pod.
Well, thank you very much.
That's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening to Stock the World. We'll be back with another episode soon. Ciao!